I'm not always the biggest supporter or fan of Andy Reid. I know that in one category he's a quality head coach, but then he has those problems, those flaws, those deficiencies in certain areas. That always makes me wonder, frankly, why his teams win as many games as they do and why more people don't call him into question and take him to task more often. I'm just calling it as I see it. But I have to say, I will give Andy Reid credit for this. Is that after the disaster of 2012, where the Chiefs were a mess, they finished with the worst record in the league, they got the number one overall pick. Andy Reid has brought some credibility and some respectability back to that Chiefs organization. Playoffs in 2013, another winning season in 2014, when a lot of people, myself included, thought this might be a 6 or 7 win team. They went on to go 9-7, and they did it all the while kind of under the radar. They weren't a sexy team, they weren't a sleek team, they weren't a team that a lot of people were really high on or had a lot of buzz around it all year. They just found a way to go out there and win some football games. I mean, this was a team that at times looked like they could be a force, but then reality kind of set in, and some of the flaws of Andy Reid, I think, showed through. But when you look at the Chiefs, 9-7 in 2014, frankly, I think this 9-7 record in 2014 was more impressive than the 11-5 that they posted in 2013. Yeah, that was a big dramatic turnaround, but they were playing a last place schedule then, and they were playing a very weak schedule the first half of the year. Now you've got a Chiefs team coming off of a playoff appearance last year that it has to play a much tougher schedule, and they did pretty well against that tougher schedule. I mean, they demolished New England in week number 4, just absolutely demolished them to the point where reporters were asking Belichick if it was time to reevaluate Tom Brady as a starting quarterback. They beat San Diego twice. They beat Buffalo. They beat Seattle. And this is a team with some real quality wins this year. Those are 5 wins against teams with winning records. And, frankly, they kind of owned the New England Patriots. And in some ways, you could argue they kind of dominated the Seahawks in that game. And you could kind of argue with the Chargers that they kind of dominated them to a degree both times they played them. These were impressive victories. Problem for the Chiefs was in 2014, they also found a way to lose some really bad games, like the opening week, getting kind of steamrolled by a Titans team that only won one more game the entire season. Losing to the previously winless Oakland Raiders on Thursday night in Oakland. Losing early in the season to what would prove to be a mediocre San Francisco 49ers team. That's when seasons are made, or in this case, broken. If the Chiefs find a way to win one of those games, they're in the playoffs. If they find a way to win 2 of those games, they're for sure in the playoffs. If they find a way to win all 3 of those games, they're in the playoffs, and they look like a force to be reckoned with. The other big problem for this Chiefs organization is that over the past 2 years, they just haven't been able to beat Peyton Manning. For as good as the Chiefs have been, and they've been a winning team both seasons, they just can't find a way to beat the Broncos, and that's really costly. When you know you can pencil in the Chiefs for 2 losses against the Broncos each year, it's really hard to envision them winning the division. It's really hard to see them going above a certain level. And a big reason for that is the offensive side of the ball. Alex Smith is what he is. He's a middle-of-the-road starting quarterback who's a check-down king who doesn't turn the ball over a ton, but he's not going to make a ton of spectacular plays. You look at 2014, 3,200 passing yards, 18 touchdowns, only 7 turnovers. Definitely not sexy numbers at all. Now, granted, he doesn't have a lot of help around him as the Chiefs, blazed a trail, set a record in the NFL in 2014. They got 0 touchdowns out of a wide receiver the entire season. 0 receiving touchdowns from a wide receiver. Just think about what level of incompetence that truly is. 0 touchdowns receiving out of a receiver in 2014. And then you even look at Andy Reid and his play calling philosophy, which I always question here, and I really question it. This is a team that had, again, 0 receiving touchdowns for a wide receiver in 2014. Yet somehow managed to find a way with Jamal Charles in the freaking backfield to throw the ball more than they ran the damn ball. 493 passes on the season to 420 rushing attempts. That just can't happen. You have a team that is a defense and running the ball type team. You can't throw the ball more than you fucking run the ball. At least worst case scenario, it's got to be a 50-50 split. It's just Andy Reid being Andy Reid. Too many times where Jamal Charles would have 7 rushing attempts or 9 or 11. That just can't happen. Maybe you don't want to give him 25, but Jamal Charles is one of the best all-around weapon backs in the National Football League. You got to find a way to give him more than 246 touches on a 15-game season. Jamal Charles, I understand, had a little bit of an injury problem at one point in time, but it didn't affect him that long. He missed a game, so what? You only got him the ball 246 times. Jamal Charles, at the worst, if he plays 15 games, should be touching the ball a minimum of 300, if not 325 times. That is a complete and total failure on Andy Reid's part. That is a complete and total failure by Andy Reid and his offensive coaching staff to understand what this team needs to ultimately succeed, especially with the weaknesses and massive deficiencies they have at the skill positions on the outside. That's why the Chiefs don't make the playoffs, flat out, is they can't score consistently. And they most certainly can't score through the air on the outside at all. And defensively, this is a defense that was second in the league in points allowed, seventh in total yards. Problem is they just didn't force a lot of turnovers or big plays. They tied for last in the league in interceptions, tied for 24th in the league in forced fumbles, but they still managed to get it done in terms of containing teams and preventing them from scoring a lot of points. But the problem is even if they held teams to low point totals, their offense was so inept because of Andy Reid's play calling philosophy, the ridiculousness of addressing those big needs at wide receiver in recent years, and more so the failure to do so, that this team just couldn't score points consistently enough. So what does this Chiefs team need in the offseason? Well, I'm sure Andy Reid will think an offensive or defensive lineman in round number one, and John Dorsey will be a moron and agree. But this team needs help first and foremost at the wide receiver position. They're so bad at wide receiver that I literally could argue for this team drafting a wide receiver in each of the first 2 rounds, if not each of the first 3 rounds. They're that bad. The only type of weapon that they have that they line up at wide receiver at all is DeAnthony Thomas. Dwayne Bowe's a nothing. Junior Hemingway's a nothing. Donnie Avery's a nothing. Everything else they have is basically nothing. They have nothing there. They need help at wide receiver. You cannot consider them a legitimate NFL passing attack and be able to do anything from a legitimate standpoint in the NFL if those are the type of receivers that you're trotting out there week in and week out. The Chiefs have to understand that this is not only a need, this is by far and away their biggest need. They must address this in the draft early and often. And to do so would be an example of criminal stupidity of the highest order. But that's not their only need. They could use some help still on that offensive line. They could definitely use it on the outside of tackle, and I would argue some at guard. They definitely on defense could use help at the corner position. I thought that was one real weakness for this defense in 2014. And they could maybe use some depth at the inside linebacker position as well, because I'm not sure what they really have outside of Derek Johnson. And Derek Johnson missed most of the season due to a ruptured Achilles. And he's not the youngest player anymore himself. So this is a team with needs. You look at a Chiefs team coming off of 2 consecutive winning seasons, with the coach that seems to be able to get a lot out of his players, even in spite of himself, with the terrible clock management, the terrible play calling philosophy, and frankly, the out-of-touch, nonsensical drafting. You look at the fact that they drafted Dee Ford in the first round when they didn't have a second-round pick, and they already had Justin Houston and Tom Bahali. You talk about preparing for the future, thinking that he's the best player on the board, but did you really think Dee Ford was no worse than the 23rd best player on your draft board? If that's the case, maybe there's a problem with the priorities on said draft board. You really paid the price for not taking somebody like a Kelvin Benjamin. They really paid the price for not giving a guy like Alex Smith more help on the offensive end when they sat there and gave up 2 second-round picks to get him to begin with, and then on top of that spend a first and third-round pick in the 2014 draft on 2 project players on the defensive side of the ball. Not very wise for the short term, and frankly, not very wise for the long term either if you're Kansas City Chiefs. This is a Chiefs team that must address these deficiency areas. Best player available, my ass. You have to address these needs, because if you do not, you will always end up in the same spot. You'll be winning 9 games, 10 games, maybe 8 games every year, but nobody will ultimately need to take you seriously, and you usually end up missing the playoffs, just like you did ultimately in 2014.